Hi Janos, here is some feedback from your mock exam that you did just before Christmas. So if we look at question 1, you've got all 4 questions right there, so that's a good start with 4 marks in the bag. So if we move on to question 2 now, I think you've slightly misunderstood the second letter in source B. The letter that the father's writing isn't to the headmaster, Mr. Smith, it's to the friend that Henry refers to in his letter. And the father's asking Mr. Smith to try and get to the bottom of what Henry's written in his letter. Make sure you refer back to the question at all times as well, because the question asks you to write a summary of the differences between Eddie and Henry. Quite a lot of the comments that you've made have been referring to the respective fathers. You say here, in source A, only the father speaks as he tries to solve his son's homework, and all of this here is more about the father, Eddie's father, than it is about Eddie himself. Though we do go on here to talk about Eddie being a successful boy who spends time with his family. His father's not focused on pushing him. He's saying Henry's seeking his father's attention, but Henry's only playing on his computer, so there's some good points there. But you must remember to add your quotes in as well. You've added some, but they're not always relevant to the points that you're making that are relevant to the question. I think if you'd have talked a bit about the relationships with the fathers, so you could have said that Eddie has a fun relationship with his dad. He often makes fun of him, doesn't he, showing that they have a good, fun relationship, whereas Henry's relationship with his father is quite cold and distant, judging from the fact that he's not seen him for 2 years. And also the way that they speak to the fathers. Eddie's quite informal and making fun of him a lot, whereas Henry speaks to him in a very formal way, very polite and respectful, compared to Eddie's cheeky, mocking way that he speaks to his dad. If we look at the mark scheme, level 2 says show some interpretation from one or both texts. Well, you have looked at both texts, although as I've said earlier, you've misinterpreted the second part of the second text. If we look at the bullet points, the first one says attempt some inferences from one or both texts. I think you've given some slight inference, but I think you needed to do more about what we can infer from reading between the lines about the relationships and so on, as I previously mentioned. And then the next one says select some appropriate references and textual details from one or both texts. Well, again, you've done some, but you could have done with doing some more that refer actually to the points that are needed for the question. And the statements show some differences between the text when you have given the differences between the statements, and you've used discourse markers to highlight those, such as on the other hand. So I think we need to stick at level 2 for this one, and I think really it's mark 3. Moving on to question 3, where you're asked to look at how Henry uses language to try to influence his father. Again, I think you've not quite read the question properly, because it's how does he use the language to influence his father, whereas down here you've talked about how he's influencing you and how you feel about him. So this section here isn't really relevant to the question. However, you've used hyperbole when he says, assure you we are, when he's comparing them to bears rather than Christians. So you could say that it's over-exaggeration, or it could be a simile because he's comparing them to the bears. And you do go on and explain what that means. So he's trying to tell his dad that they're being treated badly and he needs to leave that place. So that's a good point. You've also picked up on the fact that he uses repetition to gain empathy from his father, because he constantly repeats my dear father or don't mention anything. You've not really gone on to explain how he's intending to influence his father by using that. My interpretation of it would be that he's trying to let his father know how closely he feels to his dad, how he's missing him, But you could also look at it from the point of view that he's not seen his dad for 2 years, so the relationship can't be all that close. So perhaps it's a deliberate use of my dear father. He knows what he's doing, and he's deliberately doing it to try and persuade his dad that he misses him and he really needs to come home. As this is a 12-mark question, you need to write at least 4 points on the language used. And so as you've only used 2 and not really given the explanation here, I think we need to keep this at the bottom end of the level 2. So I think it scores 4 out of the possible 12 marks for this question. Moving on to question 4. Again, there's this misunderstanding of the second letter, which is to a family friend rather than to the teacher. But you have picked up that you seem to respect, that Henry's dad seems to respect the teacher. And he does show that he's more interested in George, Henry's brother, because he seems to feel that George is more truthful than Henry. So he's quite suspicious of Henry's motives in writing the letter. And then you've got the opposite, where Eddie's father doesn't show respect towards the teachers. And you've got the quote here, which is a good quote: "Who needs teachers to humiliate you when your son can do it so effectively?" You could have mentioned that he's using humour here to get his point across. Moving on, you say the biggest difference is how close the parents are to the children, which is a good point. Henry's father doesn't seem to have too much interest in meeting his children. Where Eddie's father's the total opposite. So he does try to help Eddie. And the fact that Henry's dad points out mistakes in the spelling. If we look at the mark scheme in level 1, it says make simple cross-reference of ideas and perspectives. I think you've done some of this. You have given some of the differences and the similarities between them. And then the next bullet, make simple identification of writers' methods. This is one bullet point that you haven't really done in this question. As I said, if you'd have mentioned the fact that Eddie's father, Jay, uses humour to get his point across, where he talks about being humiliated by his son who needs teachers and so on. And the opposite, that Henry's dad is quite polite and respectful in the letter that he's written. But you have mentioned that he is more interested in their education and less about the feelings. And the next bullet point goes on to say make simple references or textual details from one or both texts. You've used 1 or 2 quotes, but you need to use more to back up each point. As this question's worth 16 marks, so you need to be making at least 6 points and using quotes for each point and explaining what the inference is and also how they've got this point across, whether they've used humour, irony, respect and so on. And then the last one says show simple awareness of ideas and or perspectives. As I said before, you've given a little bit of this, but you could have gone on and done it in more detail. So I think you've got to stay at level 1 simply because there's no identification of the writer's methods in here, and that will give you a score of 3 out of the possible 16 for this question. Overall, this gives you a score of 14 out of 40, which, bearing in mind it's the first time that we've done a mock of this paper, isn't a bad score. There's lots of areas that we can build on, and we've now got 5 or 6 months to prepare you for the exams. So everything's still to play for. Keep going, keep up the good work, and just make sure you do every homework and hand the homework in, because the homework's important for me to see how you're getting on, but also for you to see how you're doing as well, and to be able to learn from any mistakes that you make. But keep up the good work and well done.